If you spend any time living in Israel, you will hear one phrase repeatedly. We are like the Sabra. The Sabra is the prickly pear cactus fruit, and it goes like this. The people born in Israel may be sharp, thorny, they're tough on the outside, but they're soft and smooth on the inside. To an outsider, though, those thorns can feel like three specific criticisms: that Jewish culture is combative, that it's unyieldingly stubborn, and that it's tight-fisted or miserly. But as someone who left organized religion behind while searching for spiritual meaning, I found that if you peel back those three sharp edges, the Jewish traits hold profound wisdom to offer the world. So let's start with the first thorn, combative. I learned about this one in an international school lunchroom. I sat down to eat, and there was an elderly teacher, highly respected. And at that time teaching history, I found myself obsessed with maps. And I was studying how maps began, specifically Columbus, but I went back in time and was looking at maps. And I found one from the 1300s where Jerusalem was pictured as the center of the world. I thought, aha, I'm living in Israel. And I wanted to show it to anyone at all. And in the lunchroom, I showed this map to this woman, and she looked at it, and her face changed, and she pointed, and she said, "What do you mean, Palestine?" And I froze, because I hadn't even really noticed that Palestine was there. To me, it's a historical artifact, but her mother had died in the Holocaust, and to her, the world wasn't ancient geography, it was an existential threat. And I picked it up and hightailed out of there. But it forced me to confront a reality of Jewish life. Conflict isn't swept under the rug. Conflict is engaged directly, forcefully, and without polite filters. In Judaism, this isn't just cultural combativeness. It's a sacred theological duty. It is argument for the sake of God and for the sake of heaven. When Jacob wrestles with the angel in Genesis 32, he doesn't submit. He fights all night and demands a blessing. God renames him Israel, literally one who wrestles with God. The Talmud is thousands of pages of rabbis fiercely arguing with one another across centuries, preserving the dissent of the minority, because truth isn't found in passive agreement, it's forged in friction. Welcome to the Altarless Traveler, a space for the spiritually curious, the questioners, and the deconstructors. To understand how this intense, tight-knit resilience operates globally, you have to look at the numbers. Today, Jewish people make up just 0.2% of the global population, roughly 15.7 million people out of more than 8 billion worldwide. I made this heat map to visualize where everyone lives, but it failed completely. Israel is geographically so tiny that on a world map, it barely even registers a pixel. So instead, I built a bar chart ranking the top countries by Jewish population, and when you look at it this way, the pattern is startling. Roughly 7.3 million live in Israel and about 6.3 million in the U.S. Number 3 is less than 500,000, and many countries do not register any Jewish population. Nearly 85% of the entire Jewish community lives in just 2 places. Which brings us to point number 2, pure, unadulterated stubbornness. If you want to experience the unyielding resolve of the Israeli psyche, just try driving in Tel Aviv. My wife and I were driving one Saturday morning. In Israel, Saturday morning, the place is shut down. The shops are shuttered. The streets are crowded with parked cars. And we found ourselves going down a one-way street, clearly marked. And then, to our surprise, here comes a man in a truck driving directly toward us. There's no room to pass. Only one car can fit going in one direction. He stops, bumper to bumper. He hangs out the window and he starts yelling. You didn't have to speak Hebrew to understand what he's saying. He wanted me to back up to let him through. I refused. I was looking. I actually pointed at the one-way sign and said, "Look, you're in the wrong." We stood there for a while. He yelled some more, and finally he backed up like 30, 40 meters, and there was a gas station, a petrol station. And then he just waited. and then he pointed for me to turn into the gas station so that he could pass by. I refused. He eventually pulled in, but then as I passed by, he looked at my wife and I like we were the ones who were idiots. That's some stubbornness. And it's easy to dismiss this as arrogance. When you study a little bit of Jewish history, you realize this unbending obstinacy is the exact reason this community still exists. In the Torah, God repeatedly describes the Israelites as a stiff-necked people. He's referring to being stubborn. In Exodus 32, after the golden calf incident, God is ready to wipe them out entirely because of this stubbornness. But Moses turns it around and he essentially argues, yes, they are impossible, they are unyielding, which is why they are the only people tough enough to carry out this covenant across centuries of future hostile empires. Over the last 2,500 years, the Jewish diaspora survived the Babylonian exile, Roman conquest, the Spanish Inquisition, Russian pogroms, and the Holocaust. Sociologists point out that any other group would have assimilated into the broader populations in which they lived within probably 3 or 4 generations. Yet through roughly 100 generations of exile, the core tradition remained intact. That same grit that makes a driver refuse to yield on a one-way street is the nerve, the chutzpah, that kept an entire civilization intact through the darkest chapters of human history. Stubbornness, when anchored to principle, is simply resilience that refuses to apologize. And that brings us to the third and most delicate thorn, that age-old stereotype that the Jewish people are cheap, calculating, or miserly with money. I ran straight into this with a group of teachers at dinner in Israel. At the end of the meal, the bill was delivered, and the bill was passed around the table for everyone to add their money to it. I put my money in, and I put in what I thought was a very generous tip. When it went around to the end, the person who counted it all up before giving it to the waiter looked at it and said, "Oh, this is way too much," took out the bill that I had put it in her purse, and then gave the rest to the waiter. I was mortified. Tipping is meant to be like generosity, and to hold back feels stingy. But to her, leaving money carelessly wasn't kindness. It was sloppy and undisciplined. And it took me a long time to realize that within Jewish tradition, money is treated with extreme intentionality because material resources are viewed as sacred, moral responsibility. In biblical tradition, careful management isn't a sin. It saves lives. In Genesis 41, Joseph doesn't handle Egypt's economy with vague good vibes. He uses rigorous accounting, strict resource rationing, and systematic stockpiling during the 7 years of plenty so that entire nations don't starve during the famine. Financial discipline is the exact vehicle of salvation. One Hebrew word for charity is tzedakah, meaning justice and righteousness. Giving isn't an optional feel-good tip. It is an obligatory, calculated redistribution required by law. What looks to an outsider like frugality is actually the foundation of institutional justice. You don't survive across centuries of a Jewish diaspora if you are careless with your money. So let's return to that prickly pear, the Sabra. When you live alongside people, it's hard to bump up against those thorns. But when you understand the history and theology underneath, the thorns reveal their true purpose. In a world that often mistakes polite silence for peace, Judaism teaches us that combative inquiry is a sacred form of love. It invites us to wrestle with the divine, to challenge dogma, and to demand truth from one another because real relationships can handle honest friction. In a world that drifts wherever the wind blows, that stiff-necked stubbornness is an anchor. It's the refusal to surrender your values, your family, or your integrity just because the path ahead is narrow and hostile. And in a world of careless success, what looks like miserly is practical stewardship. It uses discipline to build generational security and real-world justice. What I learned from Judaism isn't how to avoid life's abrasive moments. It's how to develop a thick skin to protect tenderness underneath. It taught me that you can debate fiercely, stand your ground with absolute grit, and manage your life with discipline. and still share the same table the next morning, trying to repair a broken world. Please like, share, and drop a comma. My outer shell is not a Sabra, but I can probably take whatever you have to say. Next week, we're going to head east to India and to Indonesia to take a look at Hinduism. I hope you'll join us. Thank you.